fact that SEPA, for people, SEPA is the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. Is there other problems that come from that being a quango? Is there a lack of transparency? Is there a lack of accountability? Is there any way it could be more democratised or more opened up?
Well, I think the big problem with SEPA is the same problem the Environmental Protection Agency has that the Welsh agency and everybody else in the UK has, and that's because over the last 30 years, government policy's basically been informed by neoliberal dogma that every single person is, an island, a rational actor who will only act in their own benefit. The attitude that's come from that is, well, if we give people a little nudge, if they give people a little encouragement, maybe they'll make changes for the better. But we shouldn't interfere. Instead of having a proactive stance in environmental regulation, where we make regulation and enforce them, we inspect people's cooling towers to make sure nobody's got bacteria breeding in them,
Mm-hmm.
Instead, we just sit about and wait for the Legionnaires' outbreak and hope we can contain the damage and limit the fallout from that. And it's a completely unrealistic way to do things, and a completely ineffective way of doing things. But SEPA, if it remains, certainly needs to be reformed to be a lot more proactive than it currently is. I think having it as a quango out with government control, there are advantages and disadvantages to that. I certainly don't entirely trust the centralising tendency that this government seems to have, though I understand that there are reasons that can be used to justify it as a short-term approach to solving some of Scotland's problems. I think in the long term with SEPA and with other branches of government and enforcement, you really need to have these groups fully accountable to the public, fully accountable to the electorate, and there needs to be more ways for the electorate to get involved. Now, one of the big problems Scotland has as democracy is the lack of participation at a grassroots level. Mm-hmm. We're so used, nobody in living memory, unless they've lived in another country, has had experience of a system where the local electorate can actually influence the national government. If all of the 5 million Scots who could vote were to vote against something, but a small fraction of the people in England vote for it, then it passes. Our votes don't really count. Mm-hmm. And that plus the democratic deficit in Westminster, even the English, unless they vote Conservative, their votes don't count. And the majority of them don't, actually. It's just the way that the system works. It's the largest organised minority gets mm-hmm. in. Well, I think breaking the mentality that comes from that in Scotland, that, the government are practically an alien race. We can't influence them. There's nothing we can do. That is one of the big challenges, really, that we face as a democracy. And I think it's something that both the Yes campaign and some of the proposals going through Parliament at the moment could help to address.
So the Community Empowerment Bill that's coming up, what are the suggestions? What are they trying to do with that? And do you think it's a good idea?
The main bits I think are a good idea is it's giving community groups the right, first of all, to acquire community assets and to run community assets. Now, out of this, you might see the creation of more green spaces, more allotments, and these things, as well as being good for the local environment, involve people and make them more aware of local environmental issues, make them see that actually, these things can be improved. And it's goes, of course, far beyond just pure environmental things, but then the environment touches every aspect of our lives, so it's hard to tease it all out. But also, community groups will be able to get more money for their own projects, which could well include environmental things by taking on services. That's one thing that my mum's community council group was talking about, for example, taking on things like cutting the grass and other little jobs in order to raise money for things in the community. Mm-hmm. And what I'm getting at is this involvement, because so far in urban areas, community councils really haven't taken off. People aren't using them. But by getting people more involved, what I'm hoping is that we'll see a bit more of the grassroots democracy and the grassroots activism that really you need to sustain the kind of the kind of society that can deliver a more sustainable country. For example, in Edinburgh, community groups that have sprung up along the canal have pushed for the Union Canal to be done up. Certainly in my mum's area, which is over on the west coast near Oban, people have been looking into running community allotments, getting an orchard together. Most of these things are still in their early stages, but they are there if you look for them. Another example of community involvement locally that I'm familiar with in Oban is the local fishermen have formed a cooperative and been quite proactive, at least from what I've heard from the local Marine Research Institute, Dunstafnage. They've been quite proactive in cooperating with them to establish areas where young fish can be left, where trawling, etc., is banned. And really, if you look at marine conservation and the conservation of fisheries, the people who are hoping that their grandchildren will be able to take up fishing are much more likely to listen to messages about sustainability and conservation than a government that sees fisheries as being a bargaining chip or something that can be exploited for short-term gain. Mm-hmm. So, there again, where the people who use a resource, be it a marine resource or a land-based resource, can be engaged in its conservation, that's much more likely to work, I think, than leaving it entirely to a central authority that isn't necessarily going to be accessible, transparent, or even very concerned about conserving the resource. So I think that's an area where legislation like the Community Empowerment Bill might be able to help. And it does show a commitment from the government to involving the electorate more in our politics and more in the decision-making process. And that is, as I've said several times, I think now, very important to Scotland's future.
Just to go back a minute to the SEPA, are there any kind of budget pressures that they're constrained to at the moment that makes their life more difficult?
Well, one of the things that's happened in both England and in Scotland is that the amount of environmental regulation has increased and increased and increased, especially under pressure from the EU. But the amount of money that the central government has allocated to their environmental agencies has either stayed the same or decreased. So it's a very difficult situation. I mean, I wouldn't lay all the blame for things like Legionella outbreak, things like that, at SEPA's door. They're struggling under some very, very different areas. But the outcome of the approach really is the budget pressures on SEPA and the English and Environmental Protection Agencies ridiculous. So in terms of policy, we need to decide, do we want to be able to enforce environmental regulations or not? And if the Scottish population wants these things enforced, which government does it think is most likely to listen to it? And I think in terms of the independence question, no which way I go.
It's a bit of a no-brainer that the Scottish Government are going to listen more.
It's a bit of a no-brainer there.
Okay, and it's a more general question, but apart from, the impending crisis with, not impending, it's already here, with global warming and global weirding, and there's something I'm very interested in. I've actually got another website specifically about animal extinctions that I've done for years. But are there any, in your opinion, are there any really pressing crises that need to be dealt with in Scotland quickly?
That need to be dealt with quickly? Well, again, there's, as you've said, the climate change is upon us. So we really need to do all we can to adapt to it, as well as to try and decrease our contribution towards it. I mean, I certainly think, the renewable energy are brilliant. I think that's a great step forward. But increasing the awareness of the public as to how they can make a difference is, I think, very important in Scotland. For example, I was doing a little bit of research for this interview. I came across a report published in 2009 called Society Matters: Changing Environmental Attitudes and Behaviour in Scotland, an analysis Scottish Environmental Attitudes and Behaviour Survey of 2008. And even though 86% of people saw climate change as being a problem, and even though 2/3, 68%, said they were willing to do something, even if other people weren't, they still found, for example, 44% car users who lived within a mile of their work were driving to their work. So making people aware that they can make a difference through their behaviour, through lobbying for changes in their local area, and through lobbying the government to change the way it handles things on the national and the way it interacts on an international level, can all be helpful. Really, I think some of the biggest things we need to tackle are consumerism, income inequality, and, well, really, adapting to climate change and a future where we are very much constrained by our impact on the environment.
Okay, and then just as a last serious question, is European environmental policy, does it help or hinder in a lot of the problems that are happening at the moment?
Well, I think if we're part of the UK, I'd say it's a help, because it's about, the only thing that stands between us and the neoliberal free market philosophies of the UK government. But at an EU level, I'm not sure in the long term it really is going to help as much, because what we've seen time and time again with things like REACH and other environmental legislation in Europe is it starts off very, very promising, and the initial drafts of the bills look very, very good. But once the lobbyists get involved, once pressure's put on different national governments, large as well as small, it gets watered down, it gets diluted, and in the end, it can be more of a hindrance than a help. Mm-hmm. So I think we definitely have to keep an eye on for centralising tendencies in European politics, the moves toward the European Parliament taking over more and more things, aspects that maybe should be devolved to member states, should remain in control of member states. And I think our relationship with the EU could well change over the years. If you look at, for example, what Norway does, it's been quite successful just as a member of EFTA, the free trade area. It still has to enact a lot of European legislation, but a lot of the legislation that would affect its powers as a sovereign nation, it doesn't have to take on board. So I don't know. Again, it's a difficult question.
Okay, and then just the last question, which is maybe not so serious, but bearing in mind that there might be under 18s listening, have you got any special words for Donald Trump and his golf course?
Well, I don't know. I'd be quite happy to see more wind farms going up around his golf course just to annoy the sod. But actually, when I was doing my PhD in environmental science and I was actually looking at the risk assessment of endocrine disrupting pesticides. One of the things I did look at was pesticide use in public spaces, including golf courses.
I've heard that they're something of an environmental disaster, golf courses usually.
Oh, they're horrendous. I mean, during my PhD, I was with some MSc students. We were surveying councils and other people who we managed to get to agree to interviews, and the councils were actually quite good. This was different London boroughs, and the most widespread used chemical was glyphosate, which, although there are questions about it, it's not one of the worst. And some of the councils were actually being quite proactive in what they were doing to reduce pesticide use. And the golf courses, however, we found one greenskeeper who was doing very simple things like sharpening his equipment properly, and on golf courses they have to keep earthworm casts to a minimum. So on his golf course they were sweeping them off. On other golf courses they were spraying some very nasty chemicals. And the thing about golf courses and other high intensity use grass areas is there's no limit to what you can put on them, really, pesticide wise. If it's legal to possess it, you can use as much of it as you like, because it's not a food crop. So anybody living within a mile or so of a golf course is likely to be exposed to this. So I think if I don't know about Aberdonian residents, I'd be very worried if I was living in the vicinity of his golf course, especially since being an American-run golf course, it's likely to have much higher aesthetic standards than the a British one. In the UK, people are more happy to put up with the odd nettle or dandelion as long as the green's playable, whilst in America they need everything perfect, and that of course means much more chemicals. So, if it's that kind of course, then it'll be worse for the local residents. So in terms of people in that area, I'd say, yeah.
You want the wind farms?
Well, I'd certainly say the wind farms are much less of an environmental nuisance.